If you gathered a bunch of historians, religious or not, they would agree that there once walked a man named Jesus, a real guy. He lived in Galilee, was killed by Romans, and his followers carried on after his death. But 2,000 plus years later, those are the only facts they could all agree on. But for a person as consequential as Jesus, how do we fill in the rest? And what does that picture say about ourselves? So prepare yourself for some serious questions and some not so serious questions. Like, if Jesus came to your house, what would you offer him to drink?
Oh my gosh, whatever he wants. He probably liked wine, right? He was at Cana.
Yeah. My name is Javi Zubizarreta, and welcome to Jesus' Favorite Podcast, a show where we explore the many ways we can understand one of the most important figures in history. Hi, friends. So unfortunately, this episode of Jesus' Favorite Podcast will be our last episode of the series. Some changes are coming our way at Grotto, but it only feels right that our last show should focus so much on the story of Lazarus, the man called back from the dead by Jesus only to walk the earth again. To learn more about Lazarus and his deep friendship with Jesus, we're talking with Father James Martin, a renowned author, Jesuit priest, and advocate for the LGBT community. A friend to the Pope, Father Martin has been a voice for so many through his public ministry and writings. I couldn't ask for a better guest for our final episode. Well, Father Jim Martin, friend and advisor to the likes of Stephen Colbert, Martin Scorsese, and even the Pope, author of several acclaimed books, including The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, Building a Bridge, and now your latest, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Wonderful to be with you.
I wanted to dive into your latest book. I was just on a plane ride and was able to read it on there, and it's absolutely fascinating. Come Forth. It dives into the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what made you want to write it?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the compliment. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The book, as you say, is a deep dive into that story from John's Gospel, John 11, the raising of Lazarus. And it's a kind of combination of biblical exegesis, so looking at the passage, bit by bit, sometimes sentence by sentence to understand what the gospel writer was trying to say. Second, some spirituality. So what is this story? We believe that Lazarus was raised from the dead, but what does the story mean to us in our daily lives? A little bit of a travelogue, as you will probably know from the book. So what is it like to go to current day Bethany today? What's the topography like? What is it like to go into the tomb? And then a little bit of cultural history of Lazarus. So Lazarus through art, books, poems, films, all sorts of plays, all sorts of different ways that he has appeared. And what made me want to write the book is that Lazarus has always been a source of great fascination for me. I say in the book that when I was 17 years old, 16, 17, the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth came on the air. This is for people with longer memories. And the raising of Lazarus, this was on TV. The raising of Lazarus was a really dramatic part of that. And it really captivated me. And it made me wonder, who is this guy? Because he kind of comes in and out of the Gospels. He comes into John, then you don't really, you hear from him a little bit in John 12, but then he sort of disappears. Who are these sisters, Mary and Martha? And then, as I say in the book, I was able to visit the site and then visit the site with pilgrims. And going into the tomb proved really moving for both them and for me. So I think it's my favorite gospel passage, and I really just wanted to kind of open it up for readers.
Yeah. For folks who might not be as well aware, can you tell us briefly the story of Lazarus raising and maybe some of the characters involved that you just mentioned?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So it's if you want to go back to the original, it's John 11. Verses 1 to 40 or 1 to 44, depending on how long you want to go. Basically, two sisters named Mary and Martha who live in Bethany, which is a town outside of Jerusalem, who were Jesus's friends. We know that from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus went to their house to rest and relax. They send word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus is ill. Interestingly, they call him not Lazarus, our brother, Lazarus, your disciple, or Lazarus of Bethany. They call him he whom you love. And so Jesus gets word. He's across the Jordan River. He's been threatened with stoning in the chapter before. He waits a couple of days. He goes to Bethany. The sisters greet him and say pretty strongly, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. He says, where have you laid him? They say, come and see, which is the beginning of John's gospel, which is interesting parallel. They take him to the tomb. He cries there. We go into some reasons for that in the book, not the normal reasons that people think of. And then he prays, and he says, Lazarus, come forth, or come out is the more literal translation. And he comes out, and he says, untie him and let him go. It is traditionally called, even though it's not like a contest, Jesus' greatest miracle. I know. Right. Someone said, well, who decided that? I said, well, it's kind of traditional way of talking about it. Yeah, that's a pretty big miracle. So yeah, that's the story. And it's usually read once a year in the church on the fifth Sunday of Lent, which is where most people know it. And also at funerals, it's a popular funeral reading.
Yeah, I think something that I so appreciate about the book, and also in your previous book, Jesus, A Pilgrimage, is that you invite readers to use their imagination in considering this text. In addition to the scholarship and the great amount of work that you've done, you invite people to use their imagination. And imagining Lazarus as Jesus's friend, I think, is such an interesting thing for us beyond the miracle itself. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Could you talk about that work of imagination and Lazarus's life as a friend?
Yeah, so it's important to say that even Jesus asks us to imagine things in prayer. So when he's telling a parable, right, a man had two sons, right, the parable of the prodigal son, or a man went down to Jericho. I mean, he's saying, like, imagine this story. I mean, he's telling a story. And, Jesuits, we're not the only ones that pray this way, but we invite people to pray with what's often called Ignatian contemplation, where you imagine yourself in the story and, just kind of see what happens in your prayer. It's a really rich way of doing things. You might look at the TV series The Chosen, right? Which, I mean, is obviously not a documentary, right? So it's asking us to imagine what things would be like, right? That's a kind of more common example, or more contemporary example. Jesus had friends, right? We know that from the Gospels. He knew Martha and Mary, and a lot of scripture scholars remind us that, they're kind of distinguished. They're not disciples exactly. They're not following him along the road. You might call them resident disciples or stay-at-home disciples, but they're his friends. And Lazarus is called, as I said earlier, he whom you love. That's a really powerful phrase that is used. And we don't know, there's lots of speculation how they would have known one another. Maybe they grew up together, or maybe, he kind of knew that. He kind of knew him through Martha and Mary. But it's a great reminder that Jesus had friends, right? He had not just apostles and disciples and followers, but friends. He needed friends. He was a human being. He's fully human, fully divine. That human part of him would have craved friendship. And it's a reminder of the value, as I say in the book, of friendship in the Christian life. It's a ministry in a sense. It's a really important part about the Christian life.
What do you think that tells us about God, that God had friends on this earth, that he had people he preferred maybe to spend time with?
Yeah, well, one of the definitions, the famous definition of the saints, is friends of God and prophets, right? There's that great line. I think God desires, one of the great themes of a lot of contemporary spirituality, someone like William Barry, the Jesuit spiritual writer, is God's friendship. Now, God really doesn't need anything, right? God is complete. But I think God desires our friendship, right? God wants us to be in relationship with God. And certainly Jesus had friends. And, we can sort of speculate about how the divine part fit with the human part. I mean, that really is probably the biggest mystery. But clearly he enjoyed friendships, and he spent time in Martha and Mary's house just to relax, right? And I think it's, in a sense, it's a really good question. I think it's more of an insight for us on our side, less to kind of theologize about God and the nature of God and whether or not God needs friends or desires friends. But certainly we need friendship with God, right? We need that intimacy. And, as I say in the book, Mary and Martha are very blunt with Jesus at when they ask him why he hasn't come. And Martha's very blunt with Jesus in Luke's gospel. So it shows or reveals to us that a real intimacy, the kind of intimacy that only comes with deep friendship.
You put forward a theory of Lazarus and who he might be beyond just this singular story in John. Could you tell us a little bit about who you think Lazarus might be beyond that?
Yeah, so I rely on a lot of scholarship, particularly the scholarship of Ben Witherington, who's a Protestant scripture scholar, but also other people who have made this suggestion that Lazarus may in fact be the mysterious beloved disciple in John's gospel. And for those who may not know, we don't know who the beloved disciple is. It's a character mentioned in John's gospel who is the source of many of the stories, right? So the beloved disciple is a character, but at different points it will say, we know this is true because it came from this beloved disciple, right? Who saw it. But scholars have always wondered who it is. It's not sort of specifically identified. Most people identify it with the writer of John's gospel, right? So the writer is also referring to himself, probably himself, not herself. But other people have said it's the Apostle Thomas, it's John, the son of Zebedee, it's this person, it's that person. Some people have even said it's Mary Magdalene. Unlikely, because at the cross, Jesus says to the beloved disciple, "Son, here's your mother." An increasing number of scholars believe it is Lazarus. And I put forth that theory in the book and kind of tease out some of the arguments, which are pretty compelling.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, of why Lazarus might in fact be the beloved disciple. One quick one would be,
please,
the beloved disciple. So Lazarus in John 11 is called "he whom you love," hon philes in Greek, the beloved one, right? The beloved one. And the beloved disciple, I didn't realize this until I started researching this book. The beloved disciple in John's gospel does not make his appearance until after that. So it is as if Lazarus' story in John 11 is kind of the introduction to the beloved disciple. So there's lots of internal proofs like that. And then at the end of the story, at the end of John's gospel in John 21, at the breakfast by the sea, you'll remember that Jesus, the risen Christ, is on the seashore grilling fish. The beloved disciple and Peter see him, recognize him. They both go to him. There's that long dialogue with Peter. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And then at the end, there's a really weird kind of line where Peter says to Jesus, or the risen Christ, what about him? And Jesus says, to paraphrase, well, if it is my will that he remain here till I come back, what business is this of yours? Basically, that's paraphrasing. And then the gospel writer says, because of this, the rumor arose that he would not die, right? And you have to think, well, who else would they say this about?
Sure.
Right? Other than Lazarus, right? They're not going to say this about some fisherman from Galilee. So there's all sorts of kind of what Ben Witherington calls internal proofs that lead a lot of people to believe that it might be the beloved disciple, or he might be the beloved disciple.
Sure. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, how did that land with you? Did that kind of convince you, or did it make you, what would you say, 50% sure, or what do you think?
I'm by no means am I a biblical scholar, but I think what was most fascinating to me is your telling of how the gospel would have been passed down in the oral tradition before it was, in every bookstore you could get.
Right.
And how sort of the chronology of how the story is told, as you said, he is first introduced this way as he who you loved, and then for there on after is the beloved one. And it just puts into a different light sort of the people around Jesus, right? As you call out in the book, there are the apostles, the disciples, the followers, the community. There's a lot of people around Jesus. And this person who perhaps knew him as a child. You talk about some examples from fiction of Jesus and Lazarus as kids playing in the river and so forth.
Yeah.
So I think regardless, it spurs an imagination, right, of Jesus and a friend. And as you say, the intimacy that they might have had, sharing conversations, sharing stress, sharing worries, thinking about Jesus in this way, of a human way, in a more relatably human way, I think can be really helpful for people trying to grasp God. What advice would you give to people in terms of using their imagination in this way?
That's a great question. Well, the first thing is to remember that he's fully human and fully divine. I think Catholics, I think Christians in general tend to think of him more as fully divine, which he is. The Son of God, the Messiah, right? The second person of the Trinity, he is, right? And then I think as a result, it's very hard to accept or appreciate or even deal with, his humanity. And it can be a little off-putting for people when they see Jesus acting in what you might call a human way. Now, theologians would say, no, you can't say he's acting more human in this passage and he's acting more divine in this passage. But I think we know what we mean, which is when he's, raising someone from the dead, he's kind of exhibiting more of his divine powers. But as a theologian reminded me recently, when he's raising someone from the dead, he's still human, right? It's not like he puts on his divine hat and takes off his human hat. Certainly, the imagination can help us when we think, for example, of the hidden life, right? The time between age 12 when he's found in the temple and age 30 when he begins his ministry. He lived a very normal life, and we don't know a whole lot about it. I mean, again, series like The Chosen kind of fill in those kinds of things with his mother and his family and carpentry, right? I mean, he would have been 18 years a carpenter, which is, I always point out to people, the longest estimate of Jesus's public ministry is 3 years. His carpentry time is 6 times longer than that. So he's the carpenter, for most people. And it's good to remember, like, this is something that sort of would have given him experiences. Let me just share one thing. I visited the Holy Land several times, and there's a place called Sepphoris, which I'm sure you've heard of. And Sepphoris, for those who don't know, was a city that was being rebuilt at the time of King Herod. So to be sort of clear, when Jesus was, in his young adulthood and adulthood, there was a town an hour and a half away that was being rebuilt. There's no way a carpenter would not go there just to kind of look for work.
Sure.
Nazareth is a small town. So I would think, when he's at Sepphoris, which is a very wealthy town, and he's returning to Nazareth, which was quite poor, what's going through his head? Is he thinking about income disparities? Is he thinking about the rich? Is he thinking about the poor? Has he heard stories about the rich that he kind of converts into parables? So while he is divinely inspired, he's the second person, that's Trinity, he also has human experiences. It's not just that he, these parables or whatever sort of drop from the sky because he's God or the Son of God. He has human experiences, and we have to really take those seriously, because that's a serious part of his life.
In talking about that, sometimes I feel like we hold ourselves up to such a high standard of spiritual fortitude. We feel like if we're not perfect, then we aren't living a good spiritual life. And to me, to remind myself that Jesus probably had a bum day, to imagine the divine having a bad day, I think is a helpful tool for sure.
I think you're absolutely right. To imagine him having a bad day at work, like hitting his hand with a hammer or something. Yeah. But also, we don't even have to imagine that in the Gospels. He gets angry at the disciples, and to be, even more specific, at the Passion, of course, is all of his friends abandon him, and he suffers all this terrible suffering. I think you have a really good point. Even before the Passion, he had, he struggled, he suffered. He probably saw his foster father Joseph die. Right. He certainly would have seen people he knew get sick and die. He would have probably gotten sick in different ways and struggled with poverty. And so yeah, he had a real life, Yeah. Which is why it's hard for the people of the time to accept who he is, right? Like, the great thing is in Mark, it's who is this? This is the carpenter's son?
Right. From the little backwater town of Nazareth that no one
who is this guy?
Ever came from.
Yeah.
So we're currently in a period of Lent, and I'm not sure if this podcast will be coming out while it is still Lent, but regardless, this book, Come Forth, you've offered up as a companion for this time of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. Could you give us a little bit about how this book could be used at a time like this?
The book was published in September of last year. Okay, so it's a kind of fall Christmas book. It was supposed to come out last Lent. Because with the reading of Lazarus is, as I said, the fifth Sunday of Lent. It's a very Lenten book.
Right.
The reason it didn't come out is because there were so many pictures and whatnot that needed approval and rights and all this kind of stuff that it took a long time. And it's always better to wait for the book to be 100% right. And but it's a Lenten book for a couple of reasons. First of all, that reason I mentioned, that the story of Lazarus comes up during Lent. The second reason it is a Lenten book is because in John's Gospel, the raising of Lazarus is what precipitates the Passion. So now in the Synoptics, as you know, it's the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus, throws out the money changers and the merchants and whatnot. And then that leads to the crucifixion. In John's Gospel, the cleansing of the temple comes in, I think, the second chapter, and it's Lazarus's raising that leads to the passion. And there's an interesting death, life pattern. So Lazarus's death leads to his life, which leads to Jesus's death, which leads to life. But the other reason is that the theme of the book is that, from a spiritual point of view, we are all called to leave behind or leave in our tombs, as it were, anything that keeps us unfree or stuck or bound, right? And doesn't allow us to follow God more closely. So it really is a book about giving up, letting go, and hearing God's voice call to you, saying, come forth, right? So in that way, which are very Lenten themes, right? Giving up, dying to self, and not in a masochistic way, but in a way that sort of leads to more freedom. What do you want to let go of? What can you let go of?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything during the time of Lent that we could let go of that you might recommend or consider letting go of?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the person. I think, let me pick the most common things, I think, among people. I think it would be, first of all, a desire always to be right. That's very common, right? I always have to be right. I always have to win the argument. I think very common, certainly common in my life, the desire for everyone to like me, to approve of me, to love me, right? I can't, for example, I find it very hard to say no to things that I can't do, like another talk or another whatever.
Right.
And I know deep down it's because I want everyone to like me. I can't just say, no, I can't do that. That's really that can be really unfree, right?
Yeah.
Something simple in Lent, just kind of being mean. There are a lot of things. We have all sorts of fancy ways of talking about sin and this sin and that sin. Sometimes people are just mean. You're mean, you gossip, you say something nasty to somebody, you're cruel to someone who might be have less power than you do, say in a coworker situation or a boss employee situation. All these things need to be let go. You need to kind of die to that and let that be in the tomb and hear God calling you to, come forth to a new way of living.
That's great. That's great. To talk a little bit more about imagination, we've got some rapid fire questions here.
Okay, here we go.
We want your honest answer, first thought answer, no wrong answer. So,
all right. Thank you.
All right. If Jesus had a favorite ice cream flavor, what would it be?
Now, the terrible pun would be Rocky Road because he trod a rocky road. I'd say vanilla because he found beauty in even the simplest things.
Wonderful. If Jesus had a favorite movie, what would it be?
That's so funny. That's so funny. I never thought about that. I might say Therese, the movie about Therese of Lisieux that came out in 1986. I think he'd like that.
All right. If Jesus had a favorite season, which would it be?
It's a great question. I'd say spring. We believe that Easter happened in the spring and he rose from the dead during Easter. So, yeah, I'd say spring.
All right. Would Jesus be a dog person, a cat person, or a plant person?
I think that they probably didn't have pets as we do back then, maybe. So I'd say plants. I'd say he's probably more of a plant person.
All right. If Jesus came to your house, what would you offer him to drink?
Oh my gosh, whatever he wants.
Open bar. So
I guess he probably liked wine, right? He was at Cana. Yeah. I'd say whatever you want me to do, period.
Right. What would Jesus's coffee order be?
Probably something simple, maybe, black coffee, I guess, something simple.
Would Jesus be an Apple or Android user?
Well, the Apple, of course, has so many negative connotations in the Bible, so definitely Android.
All right. And then finally, in one word, who is Jesus to you?
Oh, boy. A friend. Oh, what great. Well, let me ask you a question. What is the most surprising answer you've heard from somebody from those questions that made you laugh the most?
We went out on campus here at Notre Dame and asked a bunch of students these questions, and the favorite movie, everyone kept saying The Passion of the Christ, The Passion of the Christ, The Passion of the Christ. And I just thought, do you really think Jesus would want to watch a movie about his torture?
No. I mean, that's their favorite movie, but no. Why would he want to?
No, it'd be awful.
No. Yeah.
Father Martin, let me ask you, why did you become a priest?
Well, it was funny. I was working at GE in the 1980s. This is the mid 80s to late 80s. And I became more and more dissatisfied with the work. I mean, business is a real vocation for lots and lots of people, maybe some listeners or parents of listeners, but it just wasn't for me. And I felt more and more trapped and kind of unhappy, like a square peg in a round hole. And I came home one night and turned on the TV, and there was a documentary about Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk. And that got me thinking about first priesthood, because I didn't understand what a religious order was.
Sure.
And then I asked my local priest, I think I'd like to be a priest. And he said, you might as well talk to the Jesuits who were up the street at Fairfield University. That was the connection. I knew no Jesuits. I didn't really know what a Jesuit was. And that led into the Jesuits. And so that's my first vocation. And then in the Jesuits, you have to decide, do I want to be a priest or a brother? And I felt really drawn to be a priest for many reasons. The Mass, of course, but also preaching, right? I mean, I enjoy preaching. And so that it flows out of, I mean, it's a long answer, but there could be a very long answer, but it flows out of my Jesuit vocation. That's how I understand it. I was just hearing confessions last night at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it's just, it's a really beautiful vocation.
Yeah. What did you find at the Jesuits that called to you, spoke to you?
Yeah, a great question. I didn't really know, I didn't know any Jesuits. And so it was all brand new to me. Initially, what appealed to me as a 27-year-old young man was what they did. So I love the fact that you could be work in a parish as a parish priest and be a Jesuit. You could be a college professor and be a Jesuit. You could be a social worker and be a Jesuit. You could be a writer and be a Jesuit. You could be I have a friend who's an astronomer, right? And who can be a Jesuit. I mean, prison chaplains, you name it. There's Jesuits who are kind of doing everything. I liked that first. I thought it gave me a lot of flexibility, was exciting. I didn't feel that I would be tied down to any one thing. Of course, the irony is I've been at America Magazine for 25 years now. But, eventually what happened was I moved from that to who they were, right? Their spirituality. So it was less about what they did and more about who they are. And so really, I think I entered for what they did. I stayed for the spirituality, the finding God in all things, which really kind of fits me.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about some of the Ignatian spiritual practices unless you've maybe gone to a Jesuit school or might not be too familiar to folks?
Yeah, sure. And I have a book called The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, which talks about these at length. I think that the easiest way and probably the most accurate way of summarizing Jesuit spirituality, or Ignatian spirituality, some people call it. So it's more or less the same. Jesuit is probably more sort of focused also on Jesuit community life and the Jesuit constitutions. Ignatian is what's used today because it's for lay people, really for everybody.
Sure.
Is this idea, which I'm sure you've heard, finding God in all things. And, it's funny, sometimes those bumper sticker things don't really work and people roll their eyes at them. But in this case, we Jesuits use it, and it's accurate. And the idea is that God is not found simply in the walls of the church and the sacraments and the Bible and, sort of times on retreat, things like that, but in your daily life, in your listening to podcasts, in your relationships, and your family, and your work life, in nature, right? And so it's an invitation to see every moment of the day and everything in your day as a ways to encounter God. That's pretty, as I said, that's very shorthand, but it's also very accurate. I think being a contemplative in action, so having a contemplative stance in an active world. And then, one of the things that is very popular on Jesuit campuses is, and I'm sure on Notre Dame's campus, but maybe not explicit, is this idea of men and women for others. So it's a kind of outward directed way of living. So I think those three things are good ways of understanding Jesuit spirituality.
Yeah. You mentioned seeing a TV series and sort of that sparking your initial interest in Lazarus. Where did Jesus first get introduced to you in youth or before becoming a priest?
That's another great question I've never been asked. I was a kind of, I don't want to say lukewarm Catholic. I mean,
Sure.
I was born in 1960. And so it was, when I was growing up as a boy, the Vatican, I mean, I didn't even know what Vatican II was. When you're
Sure.
4 years old, I had no clue. But the way that Jesus was presented to us when I was, say, later on in, childhood and, adolescence was very kind of distant and, he's God. And, I was like, okay. I mean, I believed in Jesus, right? Obviously. And I went to church, most Sundays, but I didn't go to a Catholic school. I didn't go to a Catholic high school. I didn't go to a Catholic college. And I think it really wasn't. And as I said, Jesus of Nazareth, that movie from miniseries from 1977, that was kind of my introduction to the New Testament. Because I didn't take any courses. It really was when I entered the novitiate, the Jesuit novitiate in 1988, that I started to think about Jesus as someone with whom I could have a relationship with, which sounded crazy, like it sounded nuts before, but, encountering him in prayer and imagining myself in these gospel scenes. But also, and this is a really big, was a big moment for me, reading books about the historical Jesus, the human Jesus, particularly Albert Nolan's book, Jesus Before Christianity, which was really, like, he talked about him like what was he like and what was his background like? And I should have, but I never thought of it that way. I never thought of Jesus walking around and sawing wood and talking to people. I always saw him as just doing miracles. And so I think really when I entered the novitiate.
Yeah. Where have you found Jesus the most real in this world, in your work and in your daily life?
Well, here's the thing. I know I'm supposed to say in other people and service. And I certainly do find Jesus like that, but I would say in prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, the moments that I felt closest to Jesus are usually on retreats when I'm imagining myself with Jesus in a particular gospel scene. And those are the ones that are the real highlights for me. That is not to say that I don't find Jesus in those other places, but really in prayer and especially on retreat. That's for me, those are kind of the peak moments. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, not every year on retreat. But it's pretty powerful.
When you're in those moments of connection and imagination, does he look like somebody to you? Does he look like a person to you, or is it sort of an idea in your head?
Well, it's funny. My novice director told me this years and years ago, and I thought, oh, that's so sad. He said he's never been able to see Jesus's face. And I really have a hard time imagining Jesus's face. Sometimes I imagine him as Robert Powell from the Jesus of Nazareth movie. That's all I think when I get to heaven. Jesus, if I do get to heaven, Jesus will appear that way because I kind of know him that way. But no, I have a hard time with the face. I saw Jesus's face once. It was just very quick. I think what it's more kind of feeling his presence and seeing him more as a kind of body, if that makes sense, like, clothed, obviously. I think what happens is this is like spiritual erection. When I focus on it too much in prayer, I get distracted. If I say, oh, what does he look like? But other people have no trouble. I know people that have no trouble. I do a lot of spiritual direction, no trouble imagining his face. So, but not yet, not clear yet. And I think that's probably good because I think if it was ever revealed to me, I'd probably be kind of overwhelmed. How about you? Do you imagine Jesus' face in prayer?
Not in prayer, but like you, I had a similar childhood of sort of, I grew up in Idaho. Church parish life was not, we were not blessed with very active parishes. Went to public school. And similarly, when I came to Notre Dame, it was my first time being in a Catholic community, had this incredible Christology course taught by fantastic nun, Sister Mary Catherine Hilkert. And
she's wonderful.
Yeah, she's the best. And and at the same time had an experience. I lost a friend to cancer, and
I'm sorry.
Thank you. But those things together sort of, I saw Jesus in my friend's death. We lived
Wow.
with him very much up to the end,
Wow.
and his funeral, and it brought to life what it would have been to lose a friend as close as Jesus was to others. And
Wow.
um,
Like Lazarus.
very much so, of this feeling at the funeral of I was in shock. I didn't know what to do.
Sure.
And my friends are just weeping around me, and I remember just holding on to them, and it felt truly like the world was spinning around us and turning upside down, and it just made me think, the disciples feeling that 10
Yeah.
times over, and yet they persisted, and yet they carried on.
Yeah.
Often my imagination of Jesus comes as an imagination of my friend, of someone close by. So
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. I mean, that's thank you for sharing that. And it does sort of, help us understand really what the disciples would have felt.
mhm.
And St. Ignatius often says in the spiritual exercises, okay, imagine this, and how much more. So you imagine how much more if this guy were your spiritual leader, and you staked your whole life on him, and
Yeah.
how disappointed the disciples would be. But I think those experiences really do help us encounter Jesus in one another, right, in a real way. But also, I think also, I like to tell people also it helps us understand the Gospels better.
Mhm.
So oftentimes it's not just the emotional, I this kind of
Mhm.
emotional connection, but which is important, but the intellectual insight that
Yeah.
this is how the disciples would have felt. That really helps
Right.
you. I mean, I think that the Christian life is both the head and the heart, and it's
Yeah.
good for us to understand. Like, that's they're having a hard time, and they're living this story forward. They don't know how it ends.
Yeah. To put a point on it, in your work, you dive into the historical accounts of this, and how people have pointed to different scrolls that have been discovered, and there's discrepancies, there's questions. And I think sometimes we can have a fear that if we pick apart our faith, it might fall apart, and it might be revealed to us to be some fabrication of the time and legends that were built upon legends. But I know for me that hasn't been the case. It's been the opposite. And I'm
Yeah,
sure for you as well, that it's only led you down a deeper road towards Christ.
yeah. I mean, I think it's the total opposite. I just finished watching the miniseries John Adams that came out about
Mhm.
15 years ago. David McCullough stars Paul
Mhm.
Giamatti, who's up
Right.
for an Oscar. And I read David McCullough's book. I've read lots of books about John Adams. I've read multiple accounts of John Adams' life. That does not mean that John Adams didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Just because
Right.
there's difference of opinions and different
Mhm.
ways of seeing him. You know, the historical critical method of understanding the gospel, which is basically saying, how can we understand the context in which this was written,
Right.
deepens our understanding of things, right? And so,
Yeah.
that's why I say at the beginning of the Lazarus book, the beginning of Come Forth, I believe in the story. And I mean, I don't believe
Yeah.
in it in some vague way. I mean, I believe it happened, right? More or
Right.
less as that is laid out, right? And I say, if you had been in Bethany that day, you would have seen Jesus go to the tomb, then roll away the stone, and Lazarus, come out, right? But it's not unreasonable to say, all right, why was this story written this way, right? What is
Sure.
John trying to do? What are some themes that John is highlighting? Because John he's a writer, and he's editing it in a certain way to stress certain things. We don't take the Gospels literally because quite
Mhm.
frankly, in many occasions and instances, they don't agree with one another. The
Right.
infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke don't agree, right? And that's okay, because it's
Mhm.
four people telling the same story about the same real event of Jesus
Mhm.
Christ in four different ways. That's okay. So I think that's why I say at the beginning of the book, I believe this. And when we're taking these things apart, it's to understand them more deeply, not
Yeah.
to pick it apart. And I think you're right. One finds that the more they study these things, I think that the greater your faith gets.
Yeah. For sure.
Because to your point, like that story you told about your
Mhm.
friend, I mean, if you had just said, "Oh, this is baloney," I mean, you wouldn't have had that experience. You wouldn't have been
Yeah.
open to that experience of understanding the disciples in that case.
For sure. For sure. All right. I've got some more rapid fire questions before we transition to
Great.
our final segment here. If Jesus had a favorite literary genre, what would it be?
Wow. Well, that's easy. The parable.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
I mean, he really used it a lot. He liked to tell stories.
Yeah. If he had a favorite book, what would it be?
The Bible. I would hope that. I think he did have a favorite book. I mean, you might say like Isaiah. He quoted from Isaiah a lot. Yeah. But yeah, the Hebrew scriptures are we know what it is. The Hebrew scriptures are what would be called today the Old Testament.
Gotcha. All right. You are a friend of Martin Scorsese. You've been in a Scorsese film. If Jesus had a favorite Scorsese film, what would it be?
That's a great story. Now, I'm tempted to say The Last Temptation of Christ. Haha. I don't think he'd like violence. And so that gets rid of
that's
like
tough.
3/4 of Martin Scorsese's films like Goodfellas and Taxi Driver. I'd say the Age of Innocence, because it's a little gentler. It's about love. It's not about people getting, shot in the head.
No mobsters for Jesus.
That's way off the mark. Who knows?
All right. You're also a friend of late night comedy host Stephen Colbert. If Jesus was on the Colbert Show, what would he be there to promote?
Oh my gosh, that's well, he'd be there to promote what he always promotes, which is the reign of God. The reign of God is amongst you. He'd be saying. I think Colbert would. Everybody would want him on their show. Yeah.
He'd be the big get. So
he'd be the big.
All right.
Tonight, Jesus joins us. Yeah. Now I hope he'd get a standing ovation.
Yeah, one would hope. If Jesus and Lazarus were alive today, what would their favorite way of hanging out be?
Jesus, of course, is alive today, right? He is resurrected.
Correct.
Do you mean like if they were back on earth, what would they be doing?
Yeah, favorite way to chill, spend time together, what would they be doing?
I think the way he was with Mary and Martha at their house, probably just relaxing and eating. There's lots of meal stories. There's the Last Supper, but the wedding feast at Cana. There's lots of stories about the banquet. Remember, he's critiqued for being, quote, a glutton and a drunkard, right? Which I asked one scripture scholar once what that meant. And it meant that Jesus is being criticized for living it up.
Yeah.
So he probably enjoyed, hanging out and having a few glasses of wine and sure.
That's great. Continuing on the topic of imagination, but transitioning to another important aspect of your work, you use the tool of imagination in the context of the past with your book Come Forward. But in the present, you are one of the most publicly outspoken Catholic voices in support of the LGBT community and bringing them together with the church at large. I'm curious how your understanding of Christ and of Jesus in a historical, theological, and so forth context, how has that informed your ministry to the LGBT community?
Yeah, and I'm actually I'm happy to be able to talk about this, but even happier to be able to talk about Jesus, because that's sort of the focus, really the focus of my life. And it flows right out of that, because when we look at Jesus in the Gospels, in all the Gospels, where is he? He's inviting his disciples to go to people on the margins, right? So to go to people like the Roman centurion, who's not even Jewish. I mean, you can't get more outside the Jewish community than him, an occupying army, a colonizer. Jesus greets him, listens to his plea, heals his servant. I often use the story of the woman at the well, right? She's a Samaritan. She's been married 5 times. She's kind of on the outs with everybody, which is why she shows up at the well at noon in the hottest time of the day. He listens to her. He encounters her. Zacchaeus, right, the tax collector, who Jesus goes to his house, even though there's grumbling. People with leprosy, the woman with the hemorrhage. I mean, these are all people who are kind of on the margins. The Gerasene demoniac. I mean, there's someone we think of as, he's madman, but he's kind of living in the caves. He's in the tomb. He's kind of dead almost. He hurts himself, right? And Jesus goes out to him. And even the story of Lazarus, Lazarus, I mean, one of the things I say in the book, which people smile about, the literal translation of what Jesus says in Greek, doro exo means out, right, is come out. And, this is an important thing for LGBT people to say, God offers me freedom, right? God leave behind in the tomb this idea that you're a mistake, that people don't love you, that God doesn't love you. So there's just the ministry, the LGBTQ ministry, which I do with many, many other people. And we've just set up this website called Outreach, this kind of new ministry.
Which is great.
Yeah, thank you. It's all flowing from the Gospels. I mean, this all flows from what Jesus asks us to do, which is to go out and to, as a number of people have said, there's no us and them for Jesus. It's not about us and them. It's about us. So it's all about creating an us. So it's completely grounded for me in Jesus.
Queer, trans, LGBT people have been with us from the beginning of humanity, but certainly the broader movement for LGBT rights and acceptance in culture is very new, very, very new, especially in the eyes of the church where things move slow.
Sure.
In your opinion, why is it so hard for these two communities to come together or for queer people to find home in the church?
Well, I would say, first of all, there are places where people do feel comfortable and welcome. There are lots of parishes and an increasing number of parishes, schools, colleges, universities, where people feel welcome and accepted and included. I think, well, why is it? Gosh, well, I think the main reason is kind of cultural homophobia. So it's not, it's often not based on religious reasons. It's that, people in many places are homophobic. And what do I mean by that? That doesn't mean everyone that disagrees with something I say is homophobic, but it means that, in many countries, you can be executed for being gay, right? In 70 countries, you can be jailed. Look, people still in the United States there's lots of gay bashing and people make fun of gay people. So a lot of it's cultural. And then, a lot of people use kind of religious reasons to, beat up on them, basically. They use quotes from Leviticus. And one of the things I often say to people is, if you're going to use those quotes from Leviticus, then you should also need to stone women for committing adultery, kill people for taking the name of the Lord in vain or working on the Sabbath. And people say, well, I won't do that anymore. Well, why not? It's in the Bible. And so there's a kind of selective look at which Bible verses we're gonna take literally. But I think the most sort of perceptive answer came from there's a priest named Brian Massingale, and they did a documentary on my ministry called Building a Bridge, which is the same name as the book. And they interviewed Brian Massingale, who's a Catholic theologian at Fordham, and they asked him, why is there so much energy around this? And he said it's because it is where we are vulnerable. And, sexuality, body, people are vulnerable there. And they often want to kind of put people in boxes and, have very black and white rules. And if you're this way, you're not Catholic, but I'm not that way, so it's a place of deep vulnerability for people. But it really is, shocking to me. I mean, it is as if, the LGBTQ issue is the only issue in the church if you listen to some people. It's really kind of sad because they really do feel targeted. And it's sad. It makes me sad. So what I try to do is help them to feel welcome and to recognize that they're as much a part of the church as anybody else is.
In your work with members of the community, who do you tell them Jesus is to them specifically as an LGBT person?
The same that I say to anybody else, which is friend, son of God, brother, counselor, leader, Messiah, all those. And I think, the other thing I really want to say, I often listen to them. Who is Jesus for you? It's more for me to kind of help them understand their own relationship. But if they ask me, it's friend. And it's also someone, that's a really good question. It's also someone who in his public ministry on earth specifically reached out to people on the margins. So I often say to people who kind of question the church or don't understand the Gospels, or I've had a bad experience of the church, or I've had Jesus sort of used as a sort of weapon against them, to say, now look at who Jesus really is in the Gospels. Let's really look at how he treats people. Does how Jesus treats people in the Gospels is that in sync with what the Jesus that you've been taught?
Yeah.
Who supposedly, hates LGBT people when Jesus said nothing about homosexuality? Or can you find a Jesus? Can you encounter Jesus the way Jesus is presented in the Gospels, not the way that Jesus might have been presented to you by someone who, had some sort of antipathy against you. So it's really encountering Jesus in the Gospels and in prayer too.
Finally, on this topic, in December of last year, the Vatican offered its blessing of blessings to same-sex couples, and you've had the opportunity to extend these blessings. Two questions here. One, what has it been like to offer that blessing? And two, what do you hope the church will learn from this step and where it might be going from here?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, the document Fiducia Supplicans allowed priests under certain circumstances to bless same-sex couples, okay? Not the unions, but also people sort of misunderstand. They say, oh, you're blessing individuals. The document says couples, same-sex couples, so you're blessing same-sex couples. It's been surprisingly moving. I've done about, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 now, all according to the rubrics, no liturgical vestments. It's not a mass. It doesn't look like a wedding. It's private. It's just, the 2 of us, or 3 of us. And I was surprised how moved I was. I think because when I see the looks on, these couples' faces, and these, Catholic couples who've been waiting years to have something like this, it moves me. Right. And I've been kind of surprised by that because, look, I bless people all the time. I was just blessing someone last night. Right. And this morning, actually, I blessed 2 people this morning. I do it a lot. Right. And it's wonderful and it's very consoling. But it was surprisingly moving to do it to same-sex couples, I think, because they'd waited so long for something like this. And then what would I hope the church learns? I think the church would, I hope, learn to just listen to the experiences of these people. That's the key thing, to listen, right? To really be attentive, as Jesus was in his ministry, to really, you think about the Roman centurion and the woman at the well in Zacchaeus. He has dialogues with these people. It just doesn't go in and sort of run roughshod over them. The story of Bartimaeus, one of the first things he says is, what do you want me to do for you? The guy's blind and he's begging. I mean, Jesus probably knows what he's going to say, but he listens. And so can we listen to their experiences?
As you're talking about what it's been to offer this blessing, I know for me, when I heard the news and I saw the image actually of you blessing a couple soon after, there's a lot of shock and joy in it, but surprise. And just as we're talking here, you talk a lot about in your book of imagining Lazarus stepping out of that cave, or out of that tomb, and that shocked at being alive. And I think for many of us, coming out is an experience of shock and joy and wonder and seeing the world anew. And it just strikes me of how much this document and this step forward by the church is sort of a shock of joy.
A great insight. That's a great way of looking at it. Someone said to me, one of the fun things about writing a book, and also one of the kind of sometimes frustrating things, is that people will say these insights to you, like the one you just said, and you'll think, oh my gosh, why didn't I put that in the book? So I was with a group of people I was some sort of Zoom call. It was like a parish, I think. And this woman said, which I really found profound, that when Lazarus wakes up, and however he wakes up, after his death, he's in the tomb or on the tomb. He has to do something that no one has ever done before. He has to say to himself, all right, this is really crazy and new, and I don't know what's going on, but I have to get up, and I'm listening to this voice, and I'm going to listen to it. And that he had to really, on his own, assent to that call, right? To come out. He has to respond to that call. And I think there's something of that going on with the LGBT group now. That they are being called forth. I mean, I think what you say is very profound. And they have to trust that that voice is really authentic. And they have to listen to it and respond. And come out is what Jesus says.
Right.
So to be able to come forth into this new light and into this new surprising world.
Well, I've got one final round of rapid fire.
But these are fun.
Before we wrap up this wonderful conversation. So if you could ask Jesus one question, what would it be?
Oh, like that's an easy one. Why is there suffering? That is the age-old question. I'm just curious what he says. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think the second one would be, what was your life like between 12 and 30? I want to see it.
Yeah. What were your teens?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. If Jesus looked at you, how would you describe his look?
Oh gosh, I would hope, well, I'd love compassion, mercy. Yeah. Acceptance, forgiveness.
Where is Jesus most real for you?
In prayer on my retreats. Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, if Jesus had a favorite podcast, what would it be?
The one I'm on now. I would certainly invite. I would say that it would be a good idea for you to invite him on if you could.
Yeah. Yeah. Would love that. We're going to try Chat GPT to see if maybe that'll give us some insights.
Oh gosh, good luck.
Father Martin, thank you so much for your time with us today. Thank you for your work and your books and your outreach and all that you do.
Take care.
To learn more about Father James Martin, his books, and more of his work, you can follow him on Twitter at JamesMartinSJ and find his book, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, wherever books are sold.
This episode of Jesus' Favorite Podcast was hosted by Javi Zubizarreta and produced by me, Ebony Moxie. Senior producer, Josh Long. Grotto Network is Adrian Garaldi, Social Media Manager. Becky Rogers, Art Director. Kara Kenujeski, Project Manager. Ebony Moxie, Audio Storytelling Associate. Jackie Cho, Platform Storytelling Associate. Jane O'Connor, Associate Video Producer. Javi Zubizarreta, Director. Jesse McCartney, Senior Content Editor. Josh Long, Senior Video Producer. Kevin DeClute, Video Producer. Michaela Douglas, Digital Content Strategist. Mike Rossetti, Senior Manager for Community Engagement. Father Brendan McClare, Associate Producer. Ryan Brossard, Student Media Assistant. Special thanks to our guests at Notre Dame Studios. Did you like what you heard today? Please share Jesus' Favorite Podcast with a friend. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram at Grotto Network.
So one of our editors was meeting with the Pope, and one of her kids said, ask the Pope, do you like dogs better or do you like cats better? And the Pope said, and there's a picture of this editor, Carrie Weber, doubled over laughing.
Okay.
Pope says, I'm not answering that question, because if I answer that question, dogs, the headline will be, Pope Francis hates cats. And if I say cats, it'll be Pope doesn't like dogs.